We provide actionable insight on geopolitics at the intersection of capital markets. Today, I'm joined by Justin Danhof, Executive Vice President and Head of Corporate Governance at Strive Asset Management. Prior to joining Strive, Justin held numerous positions at the National Center for Public Policy Research, most recently as the Executive Vice President. Justin is one of the nation's leading corporate activists with vast experience in shareholder engagement and proxy voting. Justin's work has been widely published and quoted in major newspapers, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Politico, USA Today, the Los Angeles Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Boston Globe, and the Washington Post. He's also appeared on the Fox News Channel, One American News Network, and the Fox Business Channel, among others. Justin received his BS in economics and finance from Bentley University and his JD in LL.M from the University of Miami School of Law. So, Justin, if I missed anything in that intro, please let me know if you've been quoted anywhere else. But, fantastic to have you. Thank you for making time in your busy schedule. Really appreciate it.
I really appreciate the opportunity, Garrett.
Justin, thank you so much for hopping on again. I know you're an incredibly busy guy with a very busy schedule. So, in this conversation that we're going to sit down and have today, everything capital markets, sustainability, ESG, all of this stuff, I think it's really important to, start with the basics, right? I think if you were to ask, basic folks out there that aren't playing around in the world of data, aren't playing around in the world of capital markets, like you and I, day in and day out, you might not know or be familiar with what ESG is. So I think we'll start there. So, you at Strive and, your work that you have done prior to Strive, which has been mirrored and been a lot. If you could help explain what exactly ESG is, it's an acronym, of course, but what exactly is it? And then why does this focus shift American corporate focus away from maximizing shareholder value? And the work that Strive does, to help right the ship and remedy this issue.
Yeah, so Garrett, I appreciate it. But to answer the what, we actually have to start with the when and the where. When was ESG born and where did it come from? It actually comes from, like most three-letter bad acronyms, from an international organization.
Yeah.
So ESG was launched out of a working group from the United Nations in 2004. And I get invited to a lot of conferences to speak, as you know, Garrett, but I wasn't in the room that day. Mr. Kofi Annan did not decide to, seek and elicit my advice on this new acronym.
Unfortunately.
But it's my understanding that initially they wanted to go with SEG, but they had two problems with that. First, it sounds a little funny, and second, the goal of ESG is the S. So what is ESG? It's environment, social, and corporate governance. And the goal is S. It's changing society by changing business behavior. So why did they switch it from SEG to ESG? Well, for a couple of very simple reasons. First, we can get on a debate right now if you want. I'd prefer not to,
Sure.
On climate change and what we should do about carbon emissions.
Yep.
But what's not debatable is that businesses can actually measure their carbon emissions, right? So you stick something measurable right up front, the E. Then you stick G at the end. Why? Because whether you are a small town public library or a multinational corporation, if you do not have good corporate governance, good governance structures and strictures in place, eventually you are going to fail. So governance gives this acronym this aura of credibility about it.
Right.
And then you stick the S right in the middle. And the S is undefinable. What is social change? What is social good? What is social justice? All of these things are in the eye of the beholder, right? So it means different things to different people, different activists, different organizations. And so that's what you do. Most three-letter acronyms are not meant to define, they're meant to obfuscate. And that's exactly what ESG does. It obfuscates and it hides the goal.
Super interesting. Yeah. And again, like this is the piece and the components that I think get lost in translation. I'm also seeing some You don't have to give me your thoughts on this, but I'm also seeing some correlations to other three-letter acronymed agencies out there. So interesting stuff. So, now we've established, great, okay, what is ESG? It's environmental, social, and governance. A bit of a Trojan horse, as you're saying, with the real focus being on the S, while, let's put the E and the G on the side of the real goal. What and how? Because I think you look at Bloomberg, you look at Wall Street Journal, you look at any other news publication, that folks out there are reading, and you probably have seen some mention of this in the realm of politics, in the realm of capital markets. But why is it so insidious to corporate America? Why does it shift focus away from maximizing shareholder value? It seems confusing if we're talking about environmental issues, social issues, again, being the real issue here. And then the governance components, maybe on the surface, none of those things seem bad, but, why, from your opinion, Justin, and Strive's opinion, why is this bad for maximizing shareholder value?
Well, in essence, ESG is a sedition of the democratic system that our founders set up. Why do I say that? Well, what the ESG proponents are doing is, again, they're trying to change culture by changing business behavior. So you don't need to change the law to change culture if you can just have business adopt your policy, right? Let's give some very concrete examples of what I mean by this. Well, California has for years tried to pass laws mandating board diversity in the affirmative action sense. First, they tried to mandate that there had to be a gender balance on boards. That was thrown out even in California courts. Like, we're not talking about the Fifth Circuit here. We're talking about California courts declared that that was not legal. Then they tried to pass laws demanding people of color representation on boards. Again, thrown out of the courts. Well, what do? Well, the ESG proponents, largely the S proponents, go to companies and just demand that they themselves adopt policies for affirmative action board representation. And guess what? A whole lot of companies do. And how is this accomplished? Well, often this is done through shareholder proposals.
Yeah.
And so what do I mean by, these things change culture? Well, 2017 and 2018, there was a whole slew of shareholder proposals from activist organizations demanding that companies adopt affirmative action policies for their board of directors. Well, some companies, Facebook, now Meta, Alphabet, Amazon, they all agreed to adopt these policies. And that starts to shift culture. And fast forward about 4 to 5 years, that's when NASDAQ came out with a rule that said, we are going to kick you off of our public exchange unless you have 2 diverse board members, right? That's when Goldman Sachs came out and announced that they were no longer going to finance your IPO, your initial public offering, unless you had 2 diverse board seats. So the agent of change in American society went from as you sow, Jesse Jackson type shareholder activist to Goldman Sachs and the NASDAQ. And again, these are aggrieved political and legal actors that are unable to achieve what they want through Capitol Hill or state houses or state or federal courts. And so they're using the back door of corporate America to achieve the societal goals that they seek. And that is not the proper role of a publicly traded company. And why did I start this response with saying this is a sedition of the democracy that our founders set up?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, our framers were brilliant, right? We have a tripart federal government that is responsive to one another. We have a checks and balances system. And when James Madison and Thomas Jefferson sat down to write our founding documents, I don't think they hoped that one day it would be big banks and big entertainment companies that would be making major societal decisions, that would be the moral compass, the moral arbiter of what we do in culture and what we do in society. No, I think they thought that was going to be hashed out between, again, the checks and balances of our tripart federal government. But why were they super, super brilliant in the setup? Because they also set up a federalist system, right? And so we see this happening more and more since the pandemic. But if you don't like the policies of a state that you live in, they're supposed to be laboratories, right?
Right.
You can get up and vote with your feet and move to other states, which is why we've seen an exodus from California and New York and Illinois to places like Florida and like Texas. And so, again, what we are seeing is a subversion of the democratic system to shift culture.
Interesting. And a few interesting and really good pieces in there, Justin. So I think first and foremost, I have to say I'm one of those transplants from California to Houston, so I know exactly what you're talking about. And you've also brought up and mentioned the NASDAQ and them introducing these rules for diversity at the board level for public companies. And for specifically listing on the exchange of the NASDAQ, I was working at the NASDAQ at the time that they implemented that rule. And I can tell you there were some definitely mixed feelings internally. So these are pretty contentious, topics that we're talking about. And again, I think the focus here is that all of this detracts from, what public companies probably should be doing is just focusing on maximizing shareholder value. That's why you are, in fact, a for-profit company, right? Now, everything we're talking about, I think, really good establishing of, okay, great. What is ESG? Now, why is ESG a problem for corporate America? Fantastic. Y'all at Strive do a lot of different things, but one of the things, and I think, Justin, your specific focus on how to help right this ship is a focus on corporate governance, right? So now that we've established, ESG is, probably not a proper focus, or you should be the main focus for public companies. Can you help explain what exactly corporate governance is, rather the G of ESG? And then how do you and how does Strive leverage items and tools of corporate governance such as shareholder proposals, voting for public and private engagement to help turn the ship, and then maximize shareholder value?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Gary. And so there's another term for corporate governance in the asset management space, and that's investment stewardship.
Yep.
Right. And I mean stewardship in the true biblical sense of the word, the shepherd watching over the flock, except we are watching over capital. We are watching over capital of everyday Americans that put their faith and trust in Strive that we will do what's right with that capital. And so what happened with ESG from 2004 was a slow march to 2018. So we still need to give a little bit of backstory before I fully get into how Strive utilizes our stewardship.
Please.
And so in 2018, that's when Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, sent his letter to the CEOs of corporate America. Think about that. Just pause on that for one moment. The hubris of one CEO writing a letter to every other CEO in the country, telling them how he expects them to behave.
Yeah.
What he expects them to do. Well, that year in that letter, he said that the company was going to get much more aggressive in voting their corporate proxy ballots, specifically on the E of ESG. And he wasn't kidding. BlackRock, the largest asset manager in the United States, voted against thousands of board members that year for, in Fink's view, not taking enough direct action on climate change issues. Again, this is non-material to most of the companies he's making these votes on, right? And so what happened was BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard started voting in favor of a lot of ESG shareholder proposals. And so proposals that heretofore had received very little support started creeping up 10, 15, 20, 25, 30% of the vote. And so that really changed the game. ESG, in another sense, can be seen as the Marxist march through the corporate cultural lane. And how does Marxism work? Well, it's a slow march through the institution, but then it's all at once. And so that's why, throughout the aughts and most of the teens, most Americans had no idea what ESG was. Corporations were sticking to what was germane to their business. And then 2018 going forward, every corporation is getting involved in every social issue, every headline of the day. They're being reactionary to every single social cause, and they're backing almost all of them from the orthodoxy of the pro ESG crowd. So again, that's how Marxism works. It's slow, and then all of a sudden it's in your face. Ask any of your friends at Fortune 500 companies that were there before 2018 and they're still there now. How many DEI trainings did they have in 2015? How many DEI officers did their, S&P 500 company or Fortune 500 company have?
Right.
None.
Yeah.
Would none be the answer in 2015,
I think so.
2012? And now they've got legions of them, right? And so what happened was, again, the big three, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, that collectively have more assets under management than the GDP of the United States of America, took those levers of investment stewardship and brought them to bear on publicly traded companies to bend them to their will. And so that is actually why we started Strive.
Yeah.
To push back and be a voice of reason and a voice of logic in corporate America. So we take our investment stewardship role very seriously at Strive. And where does that start? That starts with proxy voting. So we'll take a step back and we can do a little bit of proxy voting 101, because a lot of Americans simply don't engage in this process or are unaware of how it works.
Right. What even is a proxy, right? Yeah.
Exactly. So every year, publicly traded companies have an annual shareholder meeting where all shareholders, not just BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, but everyday Americans that are invested in these companies have a right to have their voice heard and their vote cast. And there's 3 sets of votes on every proxy ballot. There's a vote for the board of directors. There's a vote for management proposals, that is, proposals that are put on by the company. And there's votes on shareholder proposals. And these are property rights. These are property rights. I have to repeat that.
Right.
And so if you are not voting your Amazon ballot, your Tesla ballot, your city ballot, you are sitting out on your rights. Would you, and what the problem we've got here, Garrett, is that there's a big difference between the turnout for these elections of institutional investors, which is very high, versus retail investors. That is the everyday Americans that have, funds in a brokerage account or whatever, and the turnout rate for them is dismal. It's like the difference between a presidential election turnout and a local dog catcher election turnout. And so what happens is everyday Americans that sit out this process, they are actually amplifying the volume from BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. And so we take our vote very seriously. We vote for every board member, every management proposal, and every shareholder proposal with an eye single on maximizing long-term shareholder value, full stop. That is what we do, and that's the basis point for every vote that we make. And another thing to note about the difference that we make here at Strive is that a lot of institutional investors that vote based on an algorithm.
Yeah.
That is for board members, for example. If you're on 3 or more boards, we consider you overboarded and automatically vote against you.
Right.
Well, what if they're the best board member? That's illogical.
Yeah.
And for shareholder proposals, they vote oftentimes based on the taxonomy. That is, what is the label ascribed to that proposal? And I'll tell you what, there's a lot of pro-fiduciary, pro-shareholder proposals, but they're given a label that is called anti-ESG. Think about that. And so a lot of the large fund managers automatically vote against a lot of shareholder proposals that would protect investors, that seek to avoid unnecessary risks for investors, because they're voting based on taxonomy. At Strive, we don't vote based on taxonomy. Every single ballot item goes through a 3-level human review, and I sign off on every single vote that we make. And again, so that's the start of investment stewardship,
Right.
but that's not the end.
Yeah.
We take that to the next level. We take our votes and then we go tell the companies and talk to C-suite folks all day long why we made the votes.
Right.
Why did we vote against these 3 board members? Well, because in our view, they're advancing ESG and DEI, not long-term shareholder value.
Yeah.
They're not focused on what is, by the way, their legal duty.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Like we talk
Yeah.
about fiduciary duty as though it's just some like esoteric term.
Yeah.
No. It's the law.
Right. Yeah.
There's
Quite
duty.
literally.
There's your job is to, and legal duty is to drive long-term shareholder value. To be you have a stewardship duty as a board member and a manager of these publicly traded companies. That's the benefit of the bargain. Right? That's the benefit of the bargain of going to the capital markets,
Exactly.
going to the public marketplace, is that other folks give you their money. And as we know, every investment involves risk. Every investment could go to zero.
Of course.
They're trusting you with that capital as a publicly traded company. If you want to do whatever you want with your company, stay private.
Right.
Avoid the
Exactly.
capital markets. So what we're doing is reminding these C-suite folks and these board members who they're responsible to. They're not responsible to stakeholders. They're responsible to their shareholders. And so that's the message that we deliver, not just with our shareholder vote, but in all of our corporate engagements. That's the message we're delivering to the C-suite. And I've got to tell you, Garrett, it's been really encouraging over these past 2 years to deliver this message. And the number of companies that are so welcome to hear it would shock, I think, most folks.
I think you're right. I think you're right in that. And to draw you out on one of those pieces too, I mean, you mentioned institutions and institutional investors, their turnout for a lot of these different governance tools, proxy voting being probably the largest one, is, they come in with these inherent agendas that are focused on not maximizing shareholder value, i.e. ESG for the most part, right? And so if they're coming in voting very high on these issues, likewise, retail investors, you, I, everybody else in the United States who, 401k, any other self-directed investment account, they have low turnout. That's a problem. And I think, and as a testament to Strive's success, I mean, I think this is why y'all have seen such a high level of success, because one, retail investors are empowered and they are aware of what's being cast on the proxies and what's at stake for their investments at these public companies. People are clearly invigorated and excited to vote for the values that they believe in at these public companies, right? They want that reflected, I think, a lot of times in their portfolios, and just basic and focused on the basics, which is, can you maximize my ROI? Can you maximize my investment in you, right? So I think that's one point, and I also think the engagement with these companies is another one. So that's fantastic, Justin. I really appreciate that. So we talked about ESG. Why is it bad for corporate America? Some of the items that Strive is doing to help turn the ship and maximize long-run shareholder value. But let's bring it out a little bit, right? So everything that we've talked about thus far has been around and centered on what's going on inside the United States, right? And, at a large scale, we're talking about why ESG is shifting focus and why it's bad for corporate America. How, if we think about it at a global level, what are your thoughts, Justin, on how ESG and stakeholder focus, how does this harm U.S. strategic competitiveness, on the global stage, right? I mean, I think about places like Europe and European capitalism, and how that's influenced the United States, and the work that's being done at Strive and other places to push back on this, Asia and other places. But does this impact U.S. global competitiveness? Does it not? Should we be worried about this? Just curious on your thoughts there.
Well, we should be mortified. Quite simply, Garrett, we're empowering autocrats all around the world.
Yeah.
Right? So if we hamstring our own businesses with unnecessary constraints, because that's what ESG is a constraint on business, Do you think China is constraining their companies with board diversity requirements?
I have to think not. I think
With,
probably
with
not.
carbon, with carbon reduction goals that are arbitrary
Right.
and made up by international bodies that have been wrong on every single environmental prediction they've ever made, but somehow they're right this time?
Yeah. Right.
Do you think Vladimir Putin is telling Russian companies to reduce their scope 3 emissions?
Yeah. Right. I mean, it's
No.
crazy.
So
Yeah.
we're hamstringing our companies, we're hamstringing our economies,
Yep.
and for what? Again, give me the tangible benefit of any of these ESG DEI constructs. They're simply not there.
Right.
And so again, our co-founder joked that after Russia invaded Ukraine, you could call ESG exporting Soviet gas, right? Like
Yeah.
so
Pretty much.
again, what we're seeing here is a killing of our own economy and a bolstering of autocratic dictatorial regimes around the world.
Right.
And really it's so insidious. And to tie this in with the shareholder voting, one thing that is super important for folks to understand about just how ingrained ESG is into large businesses and how this is crushing individual companies that then crush sectors and drag down the economy. The most important vote that we make on every proxy ballot, in my estimation, is for the executive compensation.
Yeah.
The vote is called a say on pay, where shareholders get to give a thumbs up or thumbs down to the pay of the named executive officers of corporations. So this is the high level C-suite.
Yeah.
Okay. So funnily enough, I read a headline that said 2023 was the year of ESG retreat. Well, why do I say that's funny? Because last year, more companies in the S&P 500 tied a percentage of executive compensation to ESG and DEI than ever before.
Right.
It was the high water mark, Garrett. This is not a retreat. This is
Right.
not a retreat.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, I like to say that everybody's a fiduciary to themselves. So if you put a target out there that is, let's say, hiring your team members based on race and gender rather than meritocracy,
Right.
well, you're going to hire for race and gender rather than meritocracy.
Yeah.
Because you want to get your bonus. I did a panel a couple years ago on ESG that was titled, we were told to answer the question, is ESG evil, stupidity, or grift? The answer to that, of course, is yes.
Yeah.
But,
Right. Yeah.
but narrowly here, this is the grift of ESG, right?
Yeah.
If you can put in a bonus for, again, these are the top C-suite officers, that incentivizes them for non-financial reasons, such as diversity hiring targets, which, by the way, are illegal, but
Yeah.
companies are doing it blatantly out in the open every day, or
Correct.
reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's what they're going to do rather than focusing on their day job.
Yeah.
And so a lot of business decisions that seem very strange these days are
Yeah.
made because of perverse incentives.
Yep.
But it's not just these incentives. It is how you set corporate culture, right? Because if you're, mid-level, high-level manager and you report to the C-suite and you see that your boss is hiring based on DEI targets, what are you going to do? You're going to mimic the boss.
Yeah.
You're going to show them,
Yeah.
hey, I can even hit a higher target. Look at me. And so decision making from the top to the bottom gets worse, and you get culture rot.
Yep.
And so we're rotting the culture of our corporations in the name of this ESG DEI deity that is being laughed at in China and
Yeah.
laughed at in Russia. And so again, this is a unnecessary self-inflicted wound on the United States of America.
Right.
ESG is a threat to our sovereignty. It really, really is.
Yeah. Yeah. I would have to agree with that. I mean, what you see is just the complete non-focus, especially for public companies, but this sometimes also seeps into private companies as well. on a lot of these different issues that you're talking about. And like you said, I think the most striking piece of this is that China's not looking at these items for their companies. Russia's not looking at these items for their public companies. And moreover, besides us in Europe, maybe Canada as well, I would say most of the world is probably not focused on these different areas. So, it just seems to me really puzzling as to why, we would constrain ourselves in such a way for what has appeared to be such a long time.
Yeah,
It's crazy.
I like to think like really simply sometimes.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this.
Yeah.
If diversity is our strength,
Yeah.
as they're wont to say, how
Right.
come every Japanese company in world history hasn't failed spectacularly?
Right.
Right? Just like think about it on that simple level.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's where we are. The world stage is, I mean, they're laughing at us.
Right.
They're laughing
Right.
at us.
Especially on the corporate side, right? And so, when we talk about, and we're expanding a little bit here, the conversation, we're saying, okay, how does this impacting the United States strategic competitiveness and corporate competitiveness? And it sounds like it's impacting it incredibly negatively. So let's talk about some specifics here. And I think the biggest of these pieces, and again, I think Strive has put out some research and talked about this on some level, but the CHIPS Act. Now, semiconductors are obviously, used in most all modern day technology. I think it's been described by Strive as, and others, I'm sure, as the modern day oil rush. I mean, this is one of the most important pieces of technology that has implications for national security, for consumers, essentially everything that you could probably think of in modern day life. And funny enough, in this CHIPS Act, there was allegedly or apparently a big factor, a big focus on DEI. Now, for something that's so important and so crucial to modern day economies, and again, national security as well as consumers, why are we focused on DEI? This seems incredibly just we're not focused on the right things when we're talking about something that has this many ramifications for this many important industries.
Yeah, so for your audience that doesn't know, the CHIPS Act,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
This is about $40 billion for companies to bring chips to American soil,
Yeah.
to build foundries and fabs here in the United States. And if you read much about it, what you generally see is headlines saying Samsung's delaying their plant, Taiwan Semiconductors delaying this plant, Intel's delaying that fab. And a lot of the articles miss the why.
Right.
The why is exactly what you said. There are 19 different diversity initiatives within the CHIPS Act. So again, for like your construction,
Right.
for your workforce, for your supply chain up and down. Again, if this is such a national security issue, why in the world are we mucking it up with diversity requirements? Like if any of your audience remembers during the pandemic and during, the supply chain shortages, like when used cars got as expensive as new cars,
Yeah.
this is what we're talking about. This
Yeah.
is the exact problem. We're going to exacerbate that and put it on steroids over 19 different diversity initiatives. Why should there
Right.
be a single diversity initiative in this?
Right.
This is again, this is a supply chain and a national security chain or a national security issue. And so again, if we want to see a repeat of what happened to the supply chain during the pandemic, let's just keep up this diversity nonsense.
Yeah.
And again, what does that do? It increases our reliance on Taiwan, which could at any day now,
Yeah.
because no one knows what's going on in Washington, D.C. or who's in charge,
Hmm.
it could be annexed by Xi Jinping.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's one of the biggest pieces. I mean, every country in the world right now relies on Taiwan. Now, to answer the question, what would happen, if China and Xi Jinping, like you just said, decided, hey, we see weakness in the United States. Now's our chance. We're going to go for it. I mean, I don't even know what ramifications that would have on the United States economy, let alone the rest of the world. That's crazy. So anyway, big questions. So fantastic. We talked about chips. and why DEI is pulling focus away from that, again, for such an important topic as bringing semiconductor manufacturing back to the shores of the United States. Are there any thoughts in general at Strive, or Justin, that you hold on energy activists? I think when I talk about this topic, I always think Exxon. I know that they are a big target for a lot of folks that are pushing goals at the governance level, and for Exxon to implement a lot of things that are not core to their business. That seems like they would not make Exxon money. So why are they pushing so hard for just broadly oil companies? Which again, I think the current mix of United States energy is about 83% hydrocarbons. So we're clearly a hydrocarbon fueled economy. That's how we grow our GDP. So if that's the case, why are people pushing so hard, against one of our biggest economic driving factors via oil and gas?
Indoctrination in
Okay.
a single word,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I mean, are you telling me, Garrett, that you don't think that like spray painting planes and historical places and sitting in roads is not effective in getting your messaging out? Like,
Yeah. Right.
it's wild to watch.
Yeah.
And again, these are, if you are anti-hydrocarbon, you are also anti-human.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
let's just be very clear about that. Um, Human flourishing is a problem in many regions around the world that are just starting to turn the lights on.
Yeah.
And I like to say to all these activists here, why don't you guys take a Louisville Slugger to a region that in Africa that just got electricity for the first time and go smash all their light bulbs out.
Right. Yeah.
This is
It's the equivalent.
that's the equivalent of what you're doing.
Yeah.
And again, China is laughing at us,
Yep.
right? Like the amount of coal plants that they're creating on a weekly basis is staggering
Right.
because they want to continue to grow
Yeah.
and they want to grow a middle class. And so that's how they're doing it. And again, if carbon is a worldwide problem, one thing that I would like to export
Right.
is how we have the cleanest hydrocarbon
Yeah. Yeah.
extraction, production
Right.
in the world.
Mm-hmm.
If anybody wants to copy us on that, please feel free.
Try. Yeah. Almost
Right.
impossible. Yeah.
And who also our emission reduction as a nation has been profound over the last 3 decades.
Right.
Maybe we could export that as well as we continue to grow our economy. And so again, the E wing of the ESG activists, they are not just anti-hydrocarbon, they are anti-human. We need to remember that
Yeah.
because I don't think they always connect the two in what they're doing. And again, that's the result of the first word that I said in response to your question,
Yeah.
indoctrination.
Okay. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And a lot of the pieces that you bring up, I mean, we talk about a lot as well, specifically, when it comes to, excuse me, when it comes to, bringing up and talking about oil and gas around the world, how it uplifts people and just way of lives in general. And like you said, in China, they're currently bringing online additional coal power plants, right? So they're not worried about meeting any sort of ambiguous climate goal or climate target. It's all about energy security, kind of a separate topic. And to your point, I mean, the United States and the West collectively, just in general, produces the cleanest hydrocarbons on the planet, also the freest. If you want to compare it to places like Russia and others around the world, so that's incredibly helpful. Now, Justin, you mentioned China, and I want to shift our focus here. So we talked about DEI, oil and gas, especially in the United States. What are your thoughts on how and why long-term shareholder value is at risk to investors who put capital to work in U.S. adversaries like China? Now, give you some context, right? So, at the onset of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, U.S., of course, and the West collectively slapped a ton of sanctions on Russia. U.S. And other public companies around the world pulled their operations out. I think a small amount of companies are probably still in the process of pulling their operations out of the country for some pretty obvious reasons. Russia showed themselves to be a geopolitical adversary of the United States. We are not aligned in our values. We are not aligned in our interests and our goals for the globe. And I think in much the same vein, China also fits and has proven to show that they are in that same camp, right? So, not sharing the same values as the United States collective West, clearly not a democracy. In fact, they've put out some pretty explicit language saying that they have a very specific and different vision for what the global order of things should look like, which is heavily favored toward autocrats, right? So that's the context. Now, why is it important for investors in the West, specifically where we're sitting in the United States? Why is it detrimental to long-term shareholder value? And why is it risky for these investors to put capital to work in China when it might seem tantalizing for these higher returns at face value?
Sure. So I'll answer your question with a question. Where's Jack
Yeah.
Ma?
I still don't know. I'm still looking for him. I don't know.
Right. So
Yeah.
like obviously CEO, founder of Alibaba, for those who don't
Yeah.
know,
Mhm.
who's apparently been disappeared. And so there's a couple of things to talk about in this space. First of all, I think that the West made probably not a terrible, it turned out to be terrible, but at the time, a bet that along with exposure to capital markets, that China might adopt things like, I don't know, the rule of law, for example,
Right.
and some other freedom ideals. That bet didn't pan out. If you are a Chinese business, you owe your allegiance to the CCP.
Yeah. Yeah.
You absolutely, they control your intellectual property. They own you. And so if you're investing directly in a Chinese company, you are subject to the whims of the CCP. What do I mean by the whims of the CCP? Well, even if you're invested in an American company that has operations in China, you are at
Yeah.
the whims of the CCP. So another question for you, Garrett.
Yeah.
Do you know who owns Disney Shanghai?
I don't actually.
Well, Disney owns some of it, but the CCP controlled entities own more.
Oh gosh.
So
Yeah.
during COVID, when they decided one day to lock down Disney Shanghai and not let anybody leave until they had a negative COVID test, well, the CCP could do that and Disney couldn't say peep about it
Yeah.
because they are a minority owner in the enterprise. And so that's a risk.
Right.
When they decide they want to, just shut it down completely, what's Disney going to do? I don't know. Another risk that you talked about, companies left Russia after Russia invaded Ukraine.
Yeah.
Well, I mentioned earlier that there's a large possibility that in the near term, even medium term, that China could annex or invade Taiwan. Are American companies going to leave China over that? I don't know. But let me
I would
give
hope
you
so.
one example of a company that's got some tremendous exposure here. That's Starbucks.
Yeah.
Starbucks last year announced that they had planned to double their footprint in China by the end of 2025. That would mean 9,000 stores in China for Starbucks. Now, when Starbucks made the decision, like as you mentioned, most American companies did, to leave
Right.
Russia after they invaded Ukraine, they had a whopping 130 stores total in Russia.
Right.
So that wasn't a big hit to the shareholders. The shareholders could absorb that.
Right.
Can they absorb the closure of 9,000 locations? I don't know.
Yeah.
And that's a real problem. That's a material risk. And so there's multiple different risks with doing business in China, investing in China. The other thing to think about is if you are investing in a Chinese company, what you are actually investing in is something called a VIE, a variable interest entity, largely probably out of the Cayman Islands. So again, when the CCP decides that they own JD or they own Tencent or they own whatever,
Yeah.
and you're left holding nothing, and you go run to The Hague or somewhere else for
Right.
international arbitration, who do you think they're going to side with?
Mm-hmm.
They're going to side with China.
Yeah.
No one's going to make you whole.
Yep.
And so, you know, the climate crowd likes to say that climate risk is investment risk.
Yeah.
At Strive
Sure.
from day one, we've been clear that China risk is investment risk
100%.
for so many reasons.
And it just seems like the elephant in the room, right? It seems like, at least to me, and I know y'all at Strive, I mean, you guys are clearly talking about this. But when you see and read articles, again, I'll mention the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, just very, capital markets just in general focused publications. It seems like this is not really talked about, or at least not talked about enough. And the reason for that is, like you just said, this is an authoritarian government. They can shut down industries as they see fit if it relates to national security. And you won't be made whole. And like you just said, the Starbucks example and how exposed they are in that country, right? They're not alone. They're not alone. There are plenty of U.S. public companies that derive a lot or a good amount of their revenue from operations in China. And so what happens day one, day two, a week later, a month later, if China takes some drastic geopolitical step like a kinetic or, an actual invasion of Taiwan? I mean, this would be catastrophic to shareholders.
100%. And Garrett, I often get accused of being too doom and gloom. So let me put like a little bit of silver lining on this, right?
Cool.
I
Yeah.
mentioned, you know, we use our shareholder votes to inform our engagement. China risk was one of our top engagement topics last season, and a lot of American companies get it. They get it. There is a lot of onshoring and reshoring going on, even at
Yeah.
some large publicly traded American companies. I won't, out them here on the
Right.
show,
Sure.
lest
Yeah.
they get the angst of the CCP. But there's a lot of American companies that, again, just as I said, like they thought that when they entered the market, 2 decades ago or whenever they entered, that there was a grand deal being made that they would start adopting some Western values like the rule of law,
Yeah.
and the authoritarianism would start waning, and they lost that bet, and they understand that now. I heard so many times, look, if we had to make this decision starting in 2023 or 2024, we never would have done it, but we entered, a decade plus ago,
Hindsight's
and it's going
2020.
to, right. So yeah. So like that a lot of them get it.
Yeah. Well, that's
And
good to hear.
there's
I'm
change,
glad.
there's change happening in the space. And lest I end on like a doom and gloom on the executive compensation part we were
Yeah.
talking about earlier, last year again was the high watermark for companies tying ESG and DEI to executive compensation, and I think it will remain the high watermark forever. Why do I think that? Well, that was our number one engagement topics with companies last year. Our number one engagement companies. The Financial Times just wrote an article noting that and noting that Strive was the leader in this. We just in our portfolio companies noticed over 60 companies that ditched ESG and DEI this season that had it last season.
Yeah.
That's just in our portfolio companies.
Right. Right.
And so we're seeing positive change, and we're punching way above our weight class.
Super exciting. Fantastic. And Justin, I know you're a busy guy. I know you got to run. And so, before we wrap up this conversation, and I do really want to thank you for it. It's been all encompassing, which has been fantastic. Started small, ended really big. What is new at Strive? What should folks be looking out for from y'all? And what is new? And we'll, of course, post any links or anything down below.
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, come to strive.com to learn about all that we're doing. We've only really just scratched the surface of everything that we do at Strive. We do consider ourselves the most transparent asset manager in the world, too. So we talked a lot about our shareholder votes. Every single vote we make is up on our website. And actually, every single vote we make is available within 48 hours. No other asset manager even comes close to that.
Right.
And so, again, we have lots of resources, lots of videos, articles. We have a weekly newsletter called the Fiduciary Focus. I would encourage folks to sign up for that. A lot of great content in there. A lot of hard work goes into it every week. And then as far as what's new, I can announce that we just closed our Series B round of funding, and that we announced that we are going to launch a wealth management division. Can't say more on that right now, but I can announce that here today.
That's huge. That is fantastic. Yeah, congratulations on that, Justin. And yeah, to you and to everybody else at Strive, that's phenomenal. I might be reaching out to you on that wealth management piece. That's super interesting. Well, Justin, thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate it. Again, I know you're driving and flying around everywhere. So thank you very much for the time this afternoon, and thanks for joining me.
I appreciate it.